Critical Role Recap, Season 2, Episode 20. We started off this episode with a few more days along the road to the Labinda Swamp. The 2 previous nights that they had spent on the road went by without much issue other than the ambush that happened last episode. This episode, it was pretty uneventful along the road for the most part. They did see an encroaching mass of soldiers that were coming and going to be crossing their path. So they decided to try and speed up to get in front of them so that they wouldn't have to sit there and wait for this whole column of soldiers to walk by. But in their haste, they actually managed to destroy their cart a little bit. They messed up 2 of their wheels. Jester was able to mend one of the wheels using her mending cantrip, but the other one was too far damaged. It was too large of an area of damage for her cantrip to work on it, basically. And so then they were approached by a detachment of guards from this legion that was crossing the road. And they just kind of briefly questioned the Mighty Nine, asking them, what they were up to. The Mighty Nine then asked if they could have a little bit of aid, and the guards pretty happily agreed and sent back to retrieve a couple of Wainwrights, a couple of carpenters that could help repair the wheel. So they put together a quick mend. So these 2 workers did manage to mend the wheel temporarily, and then Jester used the newly mended wheel as a basis for her mend cantrip and managed to fix it completely, basically after the soldiers had left and the column had completely passed on its way. So they continued on their way to the swamp and spent a night out in a very heavy storm. During this storm, Yasha had her first kind of one-on-one session with Matt, much like Ford's dream sessions, where lightning bolts were kind of like striking or evoking memories, or not memories, but visions. It was kind of cryptic, but basically what you can kind of gather from it is that some sort of entity, probably related to her strange angelic powers that she seems to have, had aided her, had helped her escape the Jorhassian Empire in some way, and had kind of set her onto a new path. And he basically said that he just wanted to see her continue to grow and continue along her path and become the person that she is meant to be. So it was a bit cryptic, and not a whole lot was known from that, but sort of similar to the first dream that Ford had, where it was a bit cryptic and kind of vague. They then made their way finally into the Labinda Swamp proper, and after about an hour or 2 traveling down the road through the swamp, they heard some strange bird-like screeching in terror sound. Jester climbed up a tree and saw that there was this bird person thing stuck in the swamp with an alligator approaching her. Jester immediately engaged in combat with the alligator to try and save this bird creature thing, and the rest of the party followed up, and they ended up fighting against 2 giant alligators in the swamp. The combat went pretty smoothly at first, but then one of the alligators really latched on to Knot, literally, with its jaws, and started to tear her up pretty fiercely. Knot did actually go down, and then nearly took a hit while she was unconscious. But the haste spell that Caleb had cast on Knot earlier in the combat actually increased her AC exactly to the point that she needed in order to somehow unconsciously dodge the alligator's strike that would have been a guaranteed crit and 2 failed death saving throws. Also, the bird person went down during this fight almost immediately, but they were able to distract the alligators from finishing her off. And Jester brought up both the bird person and Knot pretty quickly. They then spent a bit of time with Jester carving open the alligators and kind of trying to harvest their skin, and also cutting open their bellies. And when Jester looked inside, she found what looked to be the remains of about 3 other bird people. And during this time, they also managed to have a kind of odd conversation with this bird person, who we learn is a 4-year-old bird creature named Kiri. Apparently, the bird people had been cursed, like their whole lineage had been cursed somewhere back in the past, and they're incapable of spoken language for the most part, but she did know how to write, and she did fully understand their own language, so she was able to respond to them and understand them. She also would occasionally mimic them sort of like a parrot, like both the voice and the words and stuff, almost like uncannily. And it was really interesting. And Matt did a pretty good job of that, especially when this 4-year-old female bird person mimicked Ford's sentence in Ford's kind of deep voice. It was really interesting. A really cool NPC. I liked Curie a lot. She was a very interesting character. But through their conversation, while Jester's cutting up these alligators, they managed to uncover that she had been escaping from the storms that are coming in from the east, from the Jorhassian Empire, I think, and moving to the west to get out of the way of this kind of evil that's coming by. And in that process, Curie had got herself stuck in the swamp, and her family had to leave her because they couldn't risk their own lives to save her, basically. So they ended up abandoning her. And so the Mighty Nine agreed to take her along with them, but doesn't really have a great plan for what they're going to do with her, because they don't really know how to find her parents, if her parents are still alive, and they don't know like what to do with her or for her, and they're not really sure of her combat abilities or how well she can protect herself. Because, like I said, she says she's 4 years old and she got caught in a swamp. So yeah, after that, they all made their way to the town, which I forget the name of, but the town is in the middle of the swamp, and some pieces are built up on stilts. Some of them are most of it is just soggy and muddy and a mess, but it's a really cool and interesting atmosphere, and it's a really cool, it's an interesting setting. And I think this episode is worth watching because there were 2 cool NPCs, and the setting itself is really interesting. Upon getting there, they asked for directions to the tavern that they had been told they could find the gentleman's contact in, and they made their way there pretty much immediately. Once they got inside the tavern, by way of an 8-foot rope ladder, which is the only way to the entrance to get into this tavern, which is interesting and cool, they did manage to find the person that the gentleman had told them to look for, who is this ratty, nasty human being with only one tooth, and that one's rotten and sticking up crooked from his underbite. After a bit of conversation, they did manage to convince him with 100 gold to sing them a song first, of course, Jester's request, and then the next day to escort them to this safe house so that they could start their job with the gentleman. They forced him to stay with him that night. They ended up getting all 4 of the rooms that this tavern had, and they forced him to stay with them and let him pick who he was going to stay with. So he picked Yasha's room. The rest of them bedded down for the night in their dank, wet, moldy rooms that were underneath the main tavern. They had to crawl through like a trap door basically to get down to the lower section of the tavern, and part of it is waterlogged, and there's some standing water on the floor even. Yeah, so a really nice restful night. Yasha in particular, she actually pushed her bed up against the door so that this guy wouldn't be able to get out, and he tried to squirm his way into her sheets, but she turned him down and forced him to sleep on the floor. And that was the end of the episode. So next episode, they're going to be going to safe house out in the swamp and figuring out what it is that's causing all this trouble and deal with it in their own way. But yeah, that's pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next week.